polygroups. So here we have two objects, and we can clearly see the polygroups, which are basically selection sets. So imagine that there's an area of interest that you may want to keep going back to. A polygroup is a great way to do that. Polygroups can also be used to separate islands for UVs, masking, a lot of other useful things to do with polygroups. So here I'll show you how to use polygroups. I'm going to Control N to clear my scene, and I'm just using the head here. So I've separated the groups into different selections for the nose, eyes, ears, mouth, and complete face. This is another reason why you want good edge loops, so that it makes it easier to select things. In this case here, I have an edge loop around the head, I have edge loops on the eyes, I have a good nasal labia fold, which I didn't make into a polygroup, going around the nose, and then I have the mouth edge loop, and the ears. And I have the ears set as individual polygroups, but you may want to just have those groups the same. So the ears as the same group, and the eyes as well. So this way, when you select the eyes, you get both eyes. Okay, so let's get to it. When you start off with ZBrush in its default state, the way to basically make any kind of selection is to hold down Control and Shift. If you hold down Control and Shift and drag, you can isolate an area, and then you can polygroup that. So in the subtool palette, in the tool palette. So here's the tool palette, which is always open and docked to the right. If you go down just about to the middle of it, you can open up polygroups, and these are all your polygroup functions. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to group visible. So this way I make this one group, and essentially you've just removed all the separate groups that I had. So we have something we call auto groups, and we have UV groups. So if we had UVs on this object, say you made this in Maya and you made UVs and you split those islands up, if you hit auto groups with UV, then you would basically get separate groups based off of your UV islands. But we don't have UVs. Actually, maybe I do. Let me try this. Auto groups with UVs. Looks like there is something happening, but we only have 3 groups. So let's go back to group visible. And so if I grab my Control and Shift and drag, and I'll just grab a section of the face here. It's a good idea to have perspective, which is P, off when you do this, so that when you go to a profile view, you're actually even on both sides, so your selection is going to go straight through. If it's in perspective, you might have a slight offset on the other side, so you're not grabbing both left and right. But if you have symmetry on, it should work just fine as well. Alright, so here I have a selection, and what I want to do is I want to group this area, so I can go to group visible. So that's as easy as it is to create a group. So if I hold down Control and Shift and tap my pen on the work area, then I have now revealed the 2 groups, the color of the group and the new added group here. So once again, if I don't want it, I can go to group visible and get rid of it. So now the selection right now with Control and Shift is a marquee. So you can hold down Control and Shift and go over here to the brushes menu and select something like Lasso instead. Now Control and Shift with Lasso Selection gives you a little bit more control over the selection. So I can snap to the side view, and because I have this edge loop going around the ear, I can just say I want to select around this. Got a nice clean selection. It's going over to the other side, and then I can hit Group Visible, or even better, I can hit Control W, and that cycles through groups. It's basically Group Visible, Control W. And let's say for some reason I wanted to have individual groups with these ears. I can hit Auto Groups, and what it does is that it recognizes the break in the display of the geometry, and it just assigns groups based on the separation. So Control and Shift, pen tap, and you reveal the whole thing. Now these groups are very similar, in color, this left ear and the head, but they are separate groups, and if I hold down Control and tap on the face, you'll see that it selected the ear group. So I'm going to make a couple of more groups, and then we'll go through some of the other choices. So I'm going to select the eye area, and I can actually just go in here and get a nice clean selection around the eye edge loop. I missed that, so what I can do is I can hold down Control and Shift, and if you just drag a shape outside the geometry, it will inverse the function, which is really nice. So here, this point spirals out, so if I keep selecting, it's not going to get a clean selection, so the edge loop is actually smaller. So I can hold down Control and Shift and drag a shape, and I can go back to the selection, and I can hold down Control and Shift with Alt as I drag, Alt, and you get a red marquee. Now the red is actually a negative selection, so it's going to hide what's ever in the selection. So this is a way to pick out polygons that you may not want in the selection. So now I have a nice clean edge loop selection, and I can either hit Control W. Control W cycles through polygroups, or I can hit Group Visible. Either way, it's assigning a group. So now I've made my selection, and I can hold on Control and Shift and drag a shape to inverse it, or tap to show all. So a couple of things. Now with the marquee selected here, the lasso, not the marquee, if I hold down Control and Shift and I tap on an edge, watch what happens. If I tap on this edge here, I can select the edge row. So you can keep tapping on there to select it around. And if you have nice clean edge loops, you can get a selection like this. And once again, if I wanted to, I can maybe hold on Control and Shift and inverse the function, and I can assign a group to this edge row, just like that. Or I can undo that and then inverse the selection and do something like auto groups. And now I have 3 selections. If I show the strip, it's actually a different color. And another really cool one now, well, first I'll show you how to keep these groups, because if you notice, what I just did basically assigned the ears and the eyes back to this group, because it's just looking at the partition and the geometry and doing auto groups based off of that. But if you don't want to lose these groups, you just hide them. So if I Control and Shift and click on the face, I can hide that. I can hide this one. Control Shift and tap on the face. Sometimes it's a little hard to select with the lasso selection. And I'm going to hide the ear. So now those parts are hidden, so I can hit auto groups. And then if I Control and Shift and click, I'll show everything. And now we have the edge loop, the face, the back of the head. So in this case now, what I would want actually is the front of the face with that extra strip. So sometimes when you click on that face, it selects the neighboring polygroup, which is very useful. So I'll do that again. If I select this edge here, because it's so close to this one, it actually selects both, which is really nice. So now that that's selected, you can Control W to assign that as a group, so you don't have a strip by itself. So I'm going to show you that one more time, but in this case here, what I'm going to do is I'll first select the face group, holding down Control and Shift and selecting the face here, and then now I can select the edge loop of the mouth. So this is a nice area right here. Control Shift. Once you Control Shift, you see that the edge is highlighted. Then you can click it. So now I selected an edge loop, and then I can hit auto groups. I can show everything, and then now I can select this edge or this face here, and because it's the end of the it's the open edge, it takes the neighboring face, the neighboring edge row, which is assigned another polygroup, and there I can just combine them by hitting group visible or Control W. Control W is nice and easy. So here I'm clicking on it a bunch of times to cycle through different colors. Sometimes we don't get the color we want, or it's too similar to the existing color, so I'll hit Control W to get different colors. So now that that's assigned, I will Control Shift Tap to show everything, and so here's my group. So a number of things that can be done. On a separate video I'll show you guys how to UV since we have these groups now. But before I do that, well, let's take a look at this body. Another useful thing to do. So here we have polygroups, and we're working. And because at some point you might get really detailed with a certain part of the body, like the torso, I'm going to switch back to my marquee. Then maybe we just want to work on the torso, so we can hold down Control Shift and tap the torso, and Shift F to hide the polygroup or the wireframe, and then you can continue your sculpture here without having to worry about looking at the whole model. So I can say, okay, I want to just work over here, go up in my levels, and start detailing this area. Very handy, and it's nice because it's now rotating around this object instead of the whole body. You're not really working with the mesh that you're not interested in is actually hidden, which is sometimes useful. You isolate an area, it's a little easier to see and concentrate on a certain area instead of the whole body. Especially like if you're working on hands. You know, sometimes you want to be zoomed in here and do some detailing. So one more thing about hands I'll show you guys is it's a useful thing to also polygroup like things like fingers, because later on we'll get into posing, and polygroups are a great way of selecting the same area. So here I'm going to select the finger, Control W. Let's get a different color. And then I'll drag a marquee over the next, Control W. And another one here. And if you hold down spacebar, you can move it over so you get a nicer selection. And here I got an extra selection there. Let's go back and do that again. And I'll purposely grab some extra polygons. Control Shift with Alt to hide the other polygons, and Control W. And then we got the pinky here. And in this case, we have a separate group, so I can just hold down Control Shift and tap it to hide it. Control W. Let's get the thumb in there. Alright, Control W. And you could take this even further if you wanted to, and you can select the other joints of the fingers. This comes in very handy later, because we will keep going back to these selections to pose it. So this posing is a little bit more complex, and we'll get there. But right now, polygrouping is a lot more useful than we even know at this point. So here I have the selections, and then if I go up in my selection, so let's say I wanted to move, you know, a particular joint, I can select it, and then I can, let's get rid of the wireframe so you can see this. I can hold down Control and tap, which gives me masking. Then I can show everything and inverse the mask by holding down Control and tapping on the tablet. So when we get into posing, this is a nice way of selecting the same area each time, over and over. Shift F, polygroups. So that's polygroups in a nutshell. If you are interested in exploring the rest of the menu, because I always just give you a brief description of the menu, but there's some other selection options for polygrouping. So there's besides the group of UVs, there's group by normals, group visible, we know group front, group mask, and from polypane and so on. So the ones that are most important, I think, are auto groups, group visible. So that's it for polygroups.